What is faith? Is it just hopeful belief? Something that we leap into blindly without knowing anything more? Or could it be something more? Hi everybody, this is Lenny Esposito again with another Come Let Us Reason podcast, and today we explore the idea of faith. This will be the first in a two-part series that I'm doing on Hebrews chapter 11, the Great Hall of Faith. And of course, Hebrews 11 begins with defining what faith is. But how should we understand that? In our modern age, people dismiss faith as belief without evidence or some other kind of wishful thinking. But what we find is faith is more than that. The biblical understanding of faith is not something that we leap into blindly. It's actually based on the character and the understanding of what we already know about who God is and what he's done in our lives. And as is shown by the many examples given to us in Hebrews 11, we can see that faith is something that culminates in a trust for the God who's made himself known to us by real evidence. Well, I hope you enjoyed this as the first of our two-part series on faith here on the Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. How is everyone? Doing well? Excited? Halloween is over. The Christmas countdown clock is running. Just way to just throw a wet blanket right over everything. But hopefully we can persevere. I'm excited to have this talk today. I think it's going to be interesting. First of all, note the title slide. You know, it takes me actually quite some time to try and figure out what kind of image I actually want to use, something that evokes the actual theme and thesis of the message. And it's not necessarily easy, so I tried a different approach today. I used artificial intelligence to build an image. So this is an AI generated, and by the way, computers are not perfect. I always say artificial intelligence isn't. So the image that it gave me after about an hour of iterations and talking through it, it wouldn't do, first of all, the main thing I wanted. The first thing I wanted was the man walking across the chasm with kind of a semi-transparent angel holding up a bridge that he's walking across or holding his foot. It couldn't figure that out. I would say opaque and it'd give me something the shade of a milk carton, white. Or a statue, which if you're a Doctor Who fan, statues of angels is really creepy. So just, but anyway, even this one, it actually only gave me one wing on the angel, so I had to pull it into Photoshop and actually build a second wing, but that's another question. Anyway, but yes, sometimes you can use technology for advancement, so just, that's fun. What is faith? It seems that we do have, in our modern society, as the word comes to us today, a lot of fuzziness about it. A lot of unfocused ideas that people have. Faith is thrown around a lot as a word, but people don't seem to have a really concrete understanding of faith, at least not in the way maybe that we use the word. It's used a lot. Sometimes It's you know, it can be like silly putty, and you can just kind of stretch it and wrap it the way you want. See, the kids aren't here, otherwise I'd have to explain why silly putty works, and you put it on the newspaper, but I don't have to do that. A lot of times you hear the word faith in modern motivational concepts, right? The Tony Robbins positive thinking crowd. And folks like that. Just faith is just my motivation to win. It's a positive belief, like all those motivational posters that you see in offices. How many of you like those motivational posters? So I actually have a series of posters that I particularly care for. And these are called demotivators. So, for example, motivation, if a pretty poster and a cute saying are all it takes to motivate you, you probably have a very easy job, the kind that robots will be doing soon. There's, of course, the believe in yourself, because the rest of us think you're an idiot. Consulting, if you're in the business world, you'll appreciate that. If you're not part of the solution, there's good money to be made in prolonging the problem. How about teamwork? A few harmless flakes working together can unleash an avalanche of destruction. Anybody who's had to contract out employees understands that. Knowledge, I had to not leave Leanne out of this, of course. I believe that children are our future, and that terrifies me. And then lastly, my favorite, mistakes. It could be that the purpose of your life is only to serve as a warning to others. I've been tempted more than once to see if I could sneak into some office building and swap their motivational posters for these and see how long it takes for people to notice. Because I'm just really curious. So you can order those on despair.com if you're so interested in. When I talk with atheists, and I've had many interactions with them, they seem to define faith a little differently than just a amorphous motivation. For them, faith is something that's irrational. Peter Boghossian wrote this book, A Manual for Creating Atheists. I actually have it on my chair there. And he lists a couple of different ways atheists define faith. The first is John Loftus, who is a fairly well-known internet atheist. Loftus says that faith is an irrational leap over the probabilities. He writes, quote, "My definition of faith is that it's a leap over the probabilities. It fills in the gaps between what is improbable to make something more probable than without faith." In other words, it fills in the gaps to make something that's improbable more probable. He's saying that I just used the word faith and now all of a sudden it becomes more probable than it used to be. As such, it's an irrational leap over the possibilities. Now, Boghossian points to this and reinforces it because he gives a dual definition of faith. He says, first of all, faith is belief without evidence. And he writes in his book, if one had sufficient evidence to warrant belief in a particular claim, then one wouldn't believe the evidence on basis of faith. Faith is the word one uses when he doesn't have enough evidence to justify holding a belief, but when he just goes ahead and believes it anyway. With that, he then says the second definition is pretending to know something you don't know. And he says faith, this is a quote, faith taints or at worst removes our curiosity about the world, about what we should value and what type of life we should lead. Faith replaces wonder with epistemological arrogance, disguised as false humility. Faith immutably alters the starting conditions for inquiry by uprooting a hunger to know and sowing a warrantless confidence. Those are strong words. Is that true? Does faith remove our curiosity? Is faith irrational? Believing without evidence, or sometimes some people say believing in spite of the evidence. Well, faith is more than simply belief. It seems like there's an active venture in commitment, as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes. Is it knowledge? Can it count as knowing something? In our text today, Hebrews 11, starting in verse 1, our author to the Hebrews gives a definition of faith. We've just heard him talk to the Hebrews about not falling back into deliberate sin, about keeping and persevering in the same way that you had done previously. And in verse 39 of chapter 10, and you have to remember these chapter divisions are not part of the original text, right? They were added later by some individuals who were trying to help be able to cite Bible verses more quickly and more cleanly. And so they tried to find some certain divisions within the text in order to start and stop. But it would be a mistake to think chapter 11 sits all by itself, and that 11 verse 1 is kind of a whole new thought that's coming out of the blue sky. It's not. It's following from, say, verse 39. We are not those who draw back and are destroyed, but who have faith and are saved. Now, faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen, for by it our ancestors won God's approval. So here is our definition of faith that we start off with in the text. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the 2 points in this definition of faith. That faith is both what the substance of faith is and what the evidence of faith is. And then I'm going to talk about what the product of faith is, which we have examples of throughout the rest of the chapter of Hebrews. We'll only go through verse 16 today, natural breaking point, and we'll pick up some more detail next week. Let me tell you, this is a hard chapter to rein back on, because you can go out on rabbit trails forever, and we're just going to talk about like 4 people, and you'll see why. But let's jump in. What is faith? Well, notice the 2 points that the author to Hebrews makes. It's the reality of what is hoped for, and the proof of not what is seen, what is not seen. In other words, there's a substance to faith. There's a reality to faith. Faith, and by the way, the definition I'm giving you, this is not exhaustive. So when you read Hebrews 11:1, when somebody says, what is faith? This doesn't mean that Hebrews 11:1 is the only definition of faith, or it's all-encompassing. It was never meant to be that. It was meant to be a specific example, a specific instance of faith. There's a specific type of faith we're talking about, and that faith shows up in certain specific ways. So it's true, but it's not exhaustive. There could be more ways, and that's important to understand. What do I mean by the substance of faith? Well, it's clear that the author says there's a future for us, the reality of what is hoped for. So faith anticipates the future. And I think through most faith claims that's true. One thing about faith is it's future focused, future looking. If I have a chair that I've never sat in before, or a bridge that I'm going to cross, I've not seen anybody else cross that bridge, I can draw some inferences as to whether it's reasonable to think I can cross that bridge, but there's an anticipation that when I do step foot onto the bridge, it will hold my weight. I was going to put a little clip of the Indiana Jones and the one with his father, with Sean Connery, Last Crusade, yes, where he has to step out in faith, and there's a bridge that you basically couldn't see because it's camouflaged by the rocks, and it captures him. But there is a step out of faith. So faith anticipates the future. It is something that we do without full knowledge, because nobody can fully know the future like we can fully know the past. But there is an inference that we draw. In fact, talking of motivational posters, maybe this one would be best. Augustine said, faith is to believe what we do not see, and the reward for this faith is to see what we believe. And that's, when we're talking about faith, I think that's important. Because we are people who understand that there are 2 worlds in which we live. There's this world, there's this present age, there's the king of the power of the air, and there's the coming kingdom, the kingdom of God, which has begun its ascent, but hasn't fully found completion on this earth as yet. But we look toward the day it will. John 20:29, Jesus told Thomas, who remember needed more than just the words of the other disciples, unless I put my finger in his side, unless I put my fingers in the holes in his hands. And Jesus says, Thomas, because you have seen me, you've believed, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. You see, faith is a knowledge claim based on evidence. The evidence of who Jesus was. The evidence of what God has done. And that's the second point. Christianity knows nothing of blind faith. And when you hear people talking about a leap in the dark in blind faith, there may be some people who do that. First of all, I don't know that that's true faith. That may be a hope. And there is a distinction between having a hope and having a faith. But faith is a trust. And a hope isn't a trust, it's a maybe. You know, I write the check and I hope they don't cash it before I can go to the bank and deposit some money. Now, it's not like you have faith. You're just playing the odds and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, right? But it's not like I have faith that this check won't get cashed. No, that's something different. Faith has a harder value to it. For the Christian, it's based in real world events, and that's important. Note the word real here. First of all, faith is based on God's character. Just like faith in your parents should be based on their character. Why in the world would any halfway intelligent 5-year-old get on a two-wheeled vehicle only because their father insisted on it and says, you don't have to worry, I've got the back of this thing. As you pedal, I will ride behind you and make sure you don't fall. Now, anybody who's experienced this, learning how to ride a bicycle, knows that that's a lie. Because he's not going to keep holding on. He's going to be running forever otherwise. But he's holding on long enough to get you going on your own. And the reason 5-year-olds do that is because they know who their father is. We trust him, right? We trust him to be there for us, to not allow us harm. In the instance that the father lets go and you crash, that could be scarring. But faith for the Christian is based upon God's character. And part of what the author is going to be doing in the book of Hebrews in chapter 11 is rehearsing God's character, is developing this idea, showing over and over again how people's faith was supported and rewarded because God is who he says he is and he does what he says he does. Another reason why faith is exercised, it's not blind, is because God has, with each one of us, met us before. We can think of times in our lives that it was dark. We can think of times in our lives where we didn't know where to turn. We can think of times in our lives where it seems like there is no escape, and yet God met us there. He may have met us to comfort our soul. He may have met us to give us provision. But either way, we know that God was there. And just looking back on what we've seen, I think it was Corrie ten Boom who said, when you look at your life, it's like sewing a tapestry, right? You see all the different colored threads, and it's a mess. It just looks like a jumble of confused and random iterations, random events. But that's looking at the back of the tapestry. When you turn it over, all of a sudden you see a beautiful picture. And one of our hopes is at the end of days, when we see that picture, We will rejoice even in the dark parts of the tapestry. But we know this because God has met us before. And we can draw upon those. One of those things that I recommend for every individual is if you have a prayer journal, and it's a good thing to keep a prayer journal, make sure that your prayer journal has 2 columns. You put the date, you put the prayer. Put the date, you put the prayer. But in this column over here, it's really important when that prayer is answered to put answered on this date and how God answered it. Because we're really good about the problems that are in front of us. We're really bad about remembering the good times that are in the answers that God gave us in the past. And you will be surprised in your prayer life, in your practice, if you do this one little task, if you don't write all the way across the prayer journal, but stop halfway and make 2 columns. In the dark times, in the times where you're facing difficulty, you can flip back through that prayer journal and say, oh, God answered this one, and God answered this one, and God answered this one. And you can take comfort and courage in that. We have faith because God has met us before. We have faith based on his past. The resurrection of Jesus. If God did not spare his own son but gave him up freely for us all, how will he not also with him give us all things? Romans 8:31 tells us. Did Jesus really die for us? If it cost God that, then how can we doubt that he has our best interests in mind? The resurrection is real, and we forget that sometimes. Do we believe, and this is some of the things I'd love to ask some of these kids who are deconverting, do you believe that Jesus is as real as George Washington? I mean, did he live and die and maybe smell bad from time to time? Did he actually yawn? Was Jesus a real flesh and blood person, not just some paper cutout or fantasy image? Did he really rise from the dead? In the same way that Washington was sworn in to lead our country. Is that event as real an event in history as any other event that we understand? Has God delivered his people in the past from events that are sometimes so amazing or so bleak that you would have thought it's over, it's done with? Note the word real in Hebrews 11:1. It's the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. That's faith. Therefore, it gives us good reason to persevere, to have that faith, to continue on. Because our future with Jesus is a real future, as real as the past is to you and me today, we can carry on. We don't hope in faith itself. Faith is our positional relation toward God. It's not faith for faith's sake. Faith is just our trust in the one with whom we have to do. And we don't hope for God to be our genie in heaven. That's not the kind of faith we're talking about. We're talking about the faith of a father, someone who has my best interests in heart, even if I may not like the things that he's telling me. Even if I have to change my attitude or suffer some discomfort in the present. And that's what the author does. He brings that up. Verse 3. By faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was approved as a righteous man because God approved his gifts, and even though he is dead, he still speaks through his faith. And by faith, Enoch was taken away, so he did not experience death. He was not found because God took him away. For before he was taken away, he was approved as one who pleased God. Now, without faith, it's impossible to please God, since one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So here we have the products of faith, and we have two examples of the extremes in one's product of faith. What do I mean by that? It's like, well, whenever you're talking about a range of possibilities, a lot of times you want to outline it by giving an extreme on either side. And it's exactly what the author from Hebrews is doing. He's giving you two end posts, if you will. The first is Abel, a faithful witness in death. Abel was faithful. Does that mean God spared him out of any discomfort? No, his brother slew him. He was slain for his righteousness. Even though he is dead, he says. Matter of fact, if you remember the story, Genesis 4, in verse 2, we read that Abel became a shepherd of flocks, but Cain worked the ground. In the course of time, Cain presented some of the land's produce as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also presented an offering, some of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. Now the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but he did not have regard for Cain and his offering. Cain was furious, and he looked despondent. This passage, of course, has caused quite a lot of discussion. Should we go into animal husbandry rather than ground farming? There's a couple of things that are going on here, and I'm just going to spend, like I said, I could go a long time, but pull me back if I go too far. Anyway, let's talk about the contrast that the writer's drawing here, because he's using some literary devices and some familiarity with the Jewish laws in order to make these points. First of all, Abel was a keeper of flocks. Cain was a tiller of the ground, worker of the ground. Now there's a contrast here between righteous Abel and wicked Cain. Right off the top. Abel is dealing with life. What's alive, what's going. Cain is dealing with dirt. And to dirt you shall return. Both are growing items. First of all, the idea of Abel being a shepherd, that's actually a hint, because shepherds in the Bible are always positive. They always talk positively, right? Who were the first people to see Jesus after he was born? The shepherds feeding their flocks at night, even before the three kings. God calls himself the good shepherd over and over again. And of course, Jesus echoes that, picks up on it from Jeremiah and other places, and says, I am the good shepherd who watch over my flock, my sheep know my voice. So that's a pretty strong comparison. When Jesus is calling himself a shepherd, you can see that the shepherds are always a good deal. Sometimes landowners and vineyard growers are positive. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're, a cruel taskmaster, and the servant has to go and say, change your bill and I'll change mine. David's a shepherd, man after God's own heart. But Cain was involved in the thing that was cursed in the previous chapter. Worker of the ground, right? That's a product of sin. The soil you shall till by the sweat of your brow. It won't just bring forth vegetation for you. You've got to work it now. That's a punishment. That's a bad thing. And note that God, when he provided this curse to Adam and Eve, immediately took living animals, slayed them, and covered Adam and Eve, teaching them that it was by the shedding of blood that your sins will be covered, not your own works. Not, what did they try to sew together? Plants. So now you have Abel bringing an offering of animals, kind of like God had laid out. And you have Cain bringing an offering of plants. Now, I don't want to make too much of this, because in the Levitical system, if you read Leviticus chapters 1 and 2, you have the burnt offering, which was the animal, burning up the fat and all that's in it. And you have the grain offering. So you can bring plants to God. But again, note the distinction. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. The grain offering could be offered by itself. It usually wasn't. It was normally offered after a burnt offering. If it was offered by itself, it was assumed that you had previously done the burnt offering at some recent past, because you have to first get your sin issue right with God before you can go on and ask for a petition or thank him for a blessed harvest or things like that. Cain would have needed to humble himself and ask his brother to provide him with a sheep in order to provide that sacrifice. You get the feeling like that's just kind of outside of Cain's personality? I'm the older brother. I can't ask him. I can't humble myself. What's the model of Jesus? He humbles himself and becomes a man. But more than that, there's one little distinction that I did notice in the text. Because it says in Genesis 4 that Abel presented some of the firstborn of his flocks, which is proper. That's the Levitical system. But it says Cain presented some of the land's produce as an offering after a course of time. It doesn't say first fruits. It just says some. I wonder, maybe Cain isn't even offering the best of what he could do and what he could grow. Abel is specifically first fruits. Cain is specifically not. So is it a surprise that the writer to Hebrews says Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain did? And he was approved as a righteous man because God approved his gifts. Even though he's dead, though, he still speaks to us now. And that's the second point with Cain and Abel. Because even though Abel seemed to not have a whole lot of ink in the Genesis account, his ministry still continues. Even today, that one act of sacrifice, that one act of righteousness leading to his death speaks to us through Hebrews. So he's a faithful witness in death. Literally, because he's dead, he's a faithful witness. Otherwise, we really don't pay much attention. That's one extreme, one pole. I'm not saying that you're all going to be slain tomorrow because you have faith. The other pole is Enoch. Enoch is a faithful witness in his walk, taken away because he did not experience death. And they quote from Genesis that he was not to be found because God took him away. Now, Enoch is another really, really interesting character. Genesis 5:22 says that, and after he fathered Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and fathered other sons and daughters, and then God took him. Some commentators hold that the phrase there meant that Enoch wasn't walking fully with God until after he fathered Methuselah. There's something about Methuselah that triggered his devotion to God. And as he continued walking those 300 years, he gets closer and closer until God finally says, okay, you're not going to experience death. You're not going to experience pain. I'm going to pull you out of all of that. Now, I wish I had my chart. I've done this in Excel before, where I've taken all the patriarchs in the Genesis 5 account, and you can put their births, and you can put basically how many years they lived until they birthed the son, and then how many years afterwards. And you can chart it into a bar graph. And because I'm a geek, I do these things. But there's a couple of fascinating things that come out. First of all, who's the longest living man in the Bible? Methuselah. That's why we use 969 years, right? Here's an interesting thing. When you chart the birth and death of Enoch, and by the way, don't miss the point in Genesis 5, because I don't remember the number now. I'm going to look it up. Genesis 5 says, Enoch was 65 years old when he fathered Methuselah, and after he fathered Methuselah, he walked 300 years and fathered other sons and daughters. So Enoch's life was 365 years. Methuselah lives 969 years, has sons and daughters as well. Methuselah's name, and Enoch seems to be a prophet. I think James tells us that he was a prophet of God. Methuselah's name in Hebrew is fascinating because it means his death shall bring. His death shall bring. How'd you like to name your kid that? Your death shall bring. Shall bring what? Well, if you line up the dates, because Methuselah lived so long, he actually outlived some of his sons. And the very day, or year, I can't say day, but if you're doing the calculations, the very year Methuselah dies is the year the flood comes upon the earth. And nowhere in the Bible does it say that. You got to actually do the calculations yourself. His death shall bring. So for 969 years, you had a message that judgment is coming. Now, first of all, I'd keep a lot of cold medicine on hand if I was Enoch, because you just don't want that kid getting sick, right? His death shall bring. Let's just keep him healthy. But here's the other experience. You see, sometimes, and by the way, note the second underscore that the writer says is in verse 6, now without faith it is impossible to please God, since the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and he rewards those who seek him. And Enoch obviously was rewarded through his consistent seeking of God. The point of the poles, Abel and Enoch, is this, that sometimes God will deliver us out of the evil of the world. Sometimes God will allow us to be overcome by the evils of the world. Either way, for his greater glory. Our faith, therefore, is to understand that it's not this world that we should be holding tightly to, as the next two examples the writer makes a point of drawing out. I remember I had a friend who was a New Testament scholar, a professor at Biola. His name is Walt Russell. And if you ever get a chance to get his books, first of all, one of the two, Sustainable Church, is one that we used as a model to build this church, to model the structure of this church. The other one was called Playing with Fire. And it's a great book about how Christians themselves can even take scriptures out of context and twist them. He did great Galatians commentaries, Romans commentaries, things like that. But I remember one of the things that Walt would say is he'd come up to you and he'd be very earnest. He'd say, Lenny, can I ask you a question? Sure. What is it? He goes, well, when they come to get me, when they're going to take me to jail, when they're going to throw me in prison for being a Christian, can I ask for the cell next to yours? Which was about a most beautiful compliment that you can receive. So, but that was him. He was trying to, in his kind way, underscore the fact that, Christian, don't think because you have faith, it makes your life easier. It doesn't. In this world, you will have persecution. Anyway, we looked at the two poles of faith. Let's look at the majority, though, of experiences that Christians have by exercising their faith in this world. And Noah and Abraham are the two choices that the author makes to show kind of how most of our faith experiences go. First of all is Noah. And we pick up the text in verse 7. By faith, Noah, after he was warned about what was not yet seen, and motivated by godly fear, built an ark to deliver his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became an heir to righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and set out for a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. He went out, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he stayed as a foreigner in the land of promise, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, co-heirs of the same promise. for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Notice architect and builder is God. You notice that phrase. That will be echoed in our memory verse of the month. Right? Jesus is the planner and perfecter. Jesus is the forerunner, the author and finisher, architect and builder. You see the equivalency there. And by the way, this is a subtle way you can see that even in the first century, they did believe that Jesus was divine. They're putting Jesus and God on the same plane by using the same phrasing for both. So Noah feared God more than men. Never saw a flood. It hadn't happened before. He's building a boat for 125 years. Now, we have laws in the city of Riverside that won't even let you put your trailer in your driveway for more than 3 days. I don't know what the code statutes were in Noah's day, but it was big enough and long enough to cause talk. I'm certain. He was warned about what was not yet seen, continued to move forward, build that, because he feared God. Awe and a reverence. That fear isn't just, oh my gosh, I better do it because he's got a loaded gun at me. It's another word that internet atheists twist. It's a awe and a reverence for someone who is above you in authority. Interestingly, when you read the account of Noah, you hear a common refrain. Noah did this. He did everything that God had commanded him. Noah, get ready to get onto the ark, because in 7 days it's coming. And by the way, he only had 7 days to gather the animals. How do you do that? You don't. It said God brought the animals to him. And his last act of faith is that God shuts him in. There's no inside door handle on the ark. God closes the door. The whole ark story is a type of Christ, and I don't have time to go into it right now, but it's actually down to the day. They give dates, and down to the day, when you calculate, again, when you look at the Hebrew calendar, the ark comes to rest on Ararat on the day that Jesus rises from the dead. It's an amazing. Anyway, yeah. But look at how big the ark is. I mean, Noah's anticipating a lot of animals. He's never once asking, how are we going to get all these animals? Who's going to go grab them? But he, motivated by godly fear, becomes obedient. He condemns the world even though the world is ridiculing him. And through that proclamation, through his faith, he tries to give the world, again, they've had the message for 969 years. Methuselah's still been around. But God puts an underscore on it for not the last 125. I'm really trying to let you guys know, yet nobody takes him up on it. Abraham set out for a place where he was going to receive an inheritance. Now, here's the interesting thing on this. Of course, Abraham is leaving the comfort of the familiar, of his family, maybe of his inheritance. In those days, you only earn what was passed down to you from your parents, right? That's how you start your business. Is if your father was a shepherd, then you're a shepherd. You hope to get a little bit of flock yourself and go on. But Abraham's leaving everything. He continued to treat this world as something that's not worthwhile. Becoming a sojourner, living in tents, living in discomfort. Sometimes faith means that we are going to live in situations that aren't as pleasant as the ones we left. How could God drag me down to this? It was because, as the author says, Abraham knew that this wasn't his home. He knew that he was looking for something better. He was waiting also beyond hope. He and Sarah both. They knew that God had promised him and his progeny the land. He didn't have it. And he's getting older. And she's getting older too. You would have thought it was beyond hope. You would have thought God failed. You would have thought, did we miss it? I'm 100. Sarah's 90. I don't know. That Hagar thing was a mess. But I just have to keep walking and believing. Maybe I misunderstood God. But I just have to keep walking. And God shows up. Now, Sarah in this passage is considered faithful. And you got to say, didn't she laugh? Didn't she like, God's going to give me a child? Come on. Didn't she dismiss it? Here's the wonderful thing about faith. The faith that we have in God means that God will cover our sins. He doesn't want it to be a perfect faith. He understands we're human. He understands we're frail. He understands we'll waver and doubt. And ultimately, if we're faithful, it's as if the waver and doubt never happened. Because Abraham was just as bad as Sarah. Figured he could do an end run around God's promises by taking Sarah's servant woman, Hagar, and we wouldn't have the whole Israel-Hamas thing problem going on today if we didn't have Ishmael coming out of that issue. I'm kidding halfway, but he also twice lied about Sarah and let the Egyptian of Pharaoh, the king, take her to possibly be his wife. Now, why was that a big problem? Because if the Egyptian Pharaoh takes her and puts her in his harem as a concubine, and then she gets pregnant, then we really don't know who the father is, do we? There's some doubt that can be sown in there. Some people could say, well, she has spent that time over here. So what does God do to make sure that there's no doubt? Shuts the womb of everybody. No births. We're all done. And the Egyptians are going like, what's going on? This isn't right. That something's weird. No births at all. God's saying, just so you don't miss the point that it was me working through you, Abraham. When Abraham left, he actually didn't do it all at once. And that's the other interesting secret. We don't find this out. We don't find this out in Genesis 6 or Genesis 12. We don't find this out in Hebrews 11. We find this out only by putting a couple of things together from Acts chapter 7. When Stephen is preaching before they stone him, he's talking to the Jewish leaders. And he says, brothers and fathers, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia. Okay, got that. Before he settled in Haran, God appeared to Abraham in the city of Ur of the Chaldees and said to him, leave your country and your relatives and come to the land that I will show you. Did Abraham do that? No. He moved upriver to Haran. Verse 4, then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to this land in which you are now living. Abraham, go to a country I will show you. Well, I'll take half a step. I'll go upriver a little bit. I'm out of the city, but it's a nice country view. Not completely foreign. Hangs out until his father dies. Abraham, what did I tell you? Go to the land that I will show you. Okay, I'm going. We never hear that because God covers the sins of those who are faithful to him. So if you stumble in your faith walk, it's not irredeemable. It's not something that you can have to say, now that doesn't mean that we plan this. We don't test God by trying to stumble. Let's see how much he can recover from this piece. But note, one of the benefits of faith is that sins are remembered no more. Abraham's sin is erased. Sarah's sin is erased. What a blessing. Lastly, the need for faith. Verses 13 through 16. The writer sums up, since all these died in faith, although they had not received the things that were promised. Notice that. Underline that. None of them was totally fulfilled in the things that they were told was coming to them. They saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents on the earth. Now those who say such things make it clear that they're seeking a homeland, as are you, Christian. If they were thinking about where they came from, they would have had an opportunity to return. But now they desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And that, of course, immediately links back to John chapter 15. Jesus said, I have prepared a place for you. Where I go, you shall also be. Couple of pieces to remember here. Number one, faith recognizes that there will be tough times. Again, a better place means that this place isn't going to be easy. The Hebrews, in Hebrews, the audience of the writer, were facing significant persecution. Matter of fact, Hebrews 10:34 says, for you sympathized with the prisoners and accepted with joy the confiscation of your possessions. Why do you think he sympathized with the prisoners? Who were the prisoners? Part of their group who were thrown in prison. This was kind of standard operating procedure for the Jewish authorities, wasn't it? They threw Paul and Silas in prison. They kept throwing everybody into prison. John and Peter were thrown into prison in Acts chapter 4. This is just what they did. You sympathized with the prisoners and accepted with joy the confiscation of your possessions. We took all your stuff. We robbed you, basically. Because that you know that you yourselves have a better and enduring possession. Hey, you've done that. That's great. Doesn't make it easy. I had a friend, probably a person that you know, who, apologist, was talking kind of amongst us and told me that he was having a real hard time of it today because while we understand that a public ministry where you're facing off against unbelievers, especially belligerent unbelievers like atheists and others, has a level of risk associated with it, every once in a while, one of the arrows that they shoot get through. And he was having a tough time. I don't know that I have the skin thick enough to do all this, he told me. And I reminded him of John 15:20. Remember the word I spoke to you, Jesus said. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. It is a good thing that you are sensitive to those attacks. The minute we become that hard in our hearts, then we're no longer doing God's service. We're just battling for the sake of battling. We don't want to put another notch on our Bible. We're dealing with issues of the heart. And it's tough sometimes. A little bit later, I experienced something similar where some guys online were going back and forth. And it's not that they made a comment about me, but they made a comment about my kids. They were trying to get to me, and it stopped me. And God brought that verse back to me as well. And I had to take a breath and say, okay, at least there's that. So it doesn't mean that there won't be tough times. Matter of fact, persecutions will increase for Christians. That is our future. I guarantee it. The Bible talks about it. Do you remember the passage in the book of Revelation, chapter 11? You have two witnesses speaking God's truth. And in verse 7, it said, when they finish their testimony, the beast that comes out of the abyss will make war with them, conquer them, and kill them because of their faith. Their dead bodies will lie in the main street of the great city, which figuratively is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. Jerusalem. The body of God's servants will lie in Jerusalem, being slain by this guy. And some of the peoples, tribes, and languages and nations will view their bodies for 3.5 days. They'll leave them out there as a showpiece of their conquering and not permit their bodies to be put into a tomb. Those who live on the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and send gifts to one another because these two prophets had tormented those who lived on the earth. 5 years ago, I would read that as, oh my gosh, how in the future must that be? How bad must we have fallen in order to get to that state? Today, I realize that that could be today, because you go to the city of God today, and there are those who are taking people's videos of corpses, of defiled bodies, and celebrating them. You go to Harvard today, and pro-Hamas supporters are celebrating the rape of young girls, where their pelvises are broken at 5 years old, the cooking of babies in ovens. This is the culture in which we live today, folks. There is nothing more evil that you can think of than what happened on October 7th. The depths of human evil was bottomed out by these individuals on those days. Just this morning, saw a video of an ambulance coming down the road and a guy with a rocket launcher taking out the ambulance. Is it a surprise that we're going to see this turned against Christianity as the world continues to gloat and revel in its debauchery? Get ready. J.P. Moreland once asked me, what do you think is the one problem plaguing the church today? J.P.'s always good about asking a question that makes you think. He never says, how's your day? He always says something provocative like that. And I said, I don't think the church is ready. I don't think they understand what's coming and how fast it's coming. But faith recognizes not only that there will be tough times, that there is hope in the future. And that's the important piece. Remember Hebrews chapter 6 when we went through it? Verse 13 says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater to swear by, he swore by himself. I will indeed bless you, and I will greatly multiply you. Abraham didn't see that. He saw one son, Isaac. And so after waiting patiently, Abraham obtained the promise. You notice, no talk of Hagar, no talk of wavering. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and for them a confirming oath ends every dispute. But because God wanted to show his unchangeable purpose even more clearly to the heirs of promise, he guaranteed it with an oath. God doesn't have to swear by an oath. His character is enough. But he said, I'll do it anyway, just to give you confidence. So that through two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge from that persecution might have strong encouragement to seize the hope set before us. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inter-sanctuary behind the curtain. Do you see how this has all been building up to this important understanding? Do you see why he kept underlying Jesus as our high priest? Jesus has entered there on our behalf as a forerunner because he has become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. We have that hope because we know these things happened. Therefore, as I said in the beginning, continue to have faith that works. Again, Hebrews 11 follows Hebrews 10. Fascinating insight. Starting in verse 34. Don't throw away your confidence, which has great reward, for you need endurance, so that after you have done God's will, you may have received what's promised. Then he quotes from Habakkuk, for yet in a very little while the coming one will come and not delay, but my righteous shall live by faith. And if he draws back, I have no pleasure in him. But we are not those who draw back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and are saved. We often think about our sometimes failures, about kind of being ashamed to be identified as a Christian in a work environment, a family gathering. It's tough. Did you notice what it says there? That God is not ashamed to be called their God? Verse 16. But they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. What if God would be ashamed to be identified with those with whom he is associated? Do we need to act in a way that we don't bring shame upon God? This was part of the problem, Akin and strange fire and all those other things that we read about in Joshua and such. Paul reinforces the same idea to the Philippians. In Philippians 2, he says, therefore, my dear friends, just as you have always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but even more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Take it a step at a time. Be cautious. But know that there is a God in heaven who will ultimately reward you. For a concluding example, I give you the famed Charles Blondin. Blondin or Blondine, French, I'm not sure which, was born in the 19th century, 1824 to be exact, lived from 1824 to 1897. He was a world-famous acrobat, primarily known for his tightrope walking skills, so much that they would use his name to kind of signify tightrope walking. There is Charles Blondin. One of his most famous stunts that kind of brought him to the prominence was walking over Niagara Falls, 1,100 feet on a 3-inch tightrope there. But he didn't just do it once. He did it again and again, and when that started getting boring, he started switching it up. He would walk over with a guy on his back. Matter of fact, couldn't find any guys to put on his back, so his manager had to be the guy. He would take a table and chairs out on the tightrope over the Niagara Falls. He even cooked an omelet. Crossed in a sack once. Once he crossed on stilts. Once on a bicycle. Amazing. On July 15th, 1859, Blondin decided another trick. He walked backwards on the tightrope, blindfolded. Wow. On the other side, he retrieved a wheelbarrow and came back to the first. Then he said to his audience, can you believe I can even carry a person in this wheelbarrow while crossing? The crowd uproariously said, yes, of course. We believe, we believe. Then Blondin posed the question, great, who will get in the wheelbarrow? Belief is trust. Christian, God is asking you to get into the wheelbarrow. Abraham got in, left it all. Noah got in, endured the rejection. Abel got in, died for his faith. Enoch got in and grew closer to God. I don't know what God has for you through faith. I do know that by faith, the evidence of what we know in the future based on the things we have seen in the past, not irrational, inference to the best explanation. Because of that, our future is secure. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for all that you've given us, for the faith that you bestow upon us, and for how you count us as worthy even when we mess up. Help us, Lord, in the days ahead to exercise that faith, to walk strong. We want to be in the wheelbarrow, Lord. Carry us so that we can cross the chasm and live forever in the city that you've built. We ask it in Jesus' name. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.